Hi, I'm Caylin McCamp, Education and Outreach Coordinator for UVM's Office of Sustainability. And for my master's capstone project, I've tried to better understand the indirect psychological impacts of climate change, best known as climate anxiety, within the campus community, and then share what I learned with campus stakeholders to start a dialogue of collective problem solving. So that is what I'm going to cover with you today. And I want to start by being clear that we are living in a climate crisis. I know that you all know that, and I'm not going to spend time expanding on that, but instead move forward with that shared understanding. The other thing I want to be clear about is that climate change is one of the many unpleasant symptoms of domination and oppression. It shares the common root of colonization and is fed by efforts to advance capitalism. It's worth spending some time with this great graphic by Rupa Myra if you have a chance. So what I do want to spend time explaining is the climate change and mental health connection, which is well established by many groups. This is a broad field, and I'm just focusing on one small sliver, which are the indirect impacts. So this diagram shows the different classes of psychological impacts that climate change can have. Public health professionals have focused mostly on the direct and acute or psychosocial impacts. In some ways, these are the easiest to measure and the most severe, so starting here makes a lot of sense. But these only kick in once someone begins experiencing climate change firsthand. So what I'm focusing on today are the indirect impacts. So these would be felt by someone who is not directly experiencing climate change. And I'm going to get into what some of the causes of indirect impacts are. So the 2016 Federal Climate and Health Assessment dedicates a chapter to mental health and well-being, and it outlines the various causes of indirect impacts, which I want to unpack quickly. So first, the threat. Teen activist Greta Thunberg has not directly experienced climate change, but she's motivated by the existential threat of it. However, she's experienced depression, eating disorders, and anxiety attacks spurred by her climate change awakening. The perceived direct experience. So this can be a bit hard to tease out, just like it's hard to understand to what degree climate change contributes to a certain weather event. People's perception of their experience with climate change is somewhat subjective. The growth of Lyme disease cases in New England is an example. So some victims link this directly to climate change, while others think of it as bad luck. So each of those stories comes with a very different psychological impact. A less severe example would be the length or consistency of a ski season. And then local environments changing. So solastalgia is a fairly new term coined to describe the distinct feeling of loss associated with altered environments. And the more of a connection that someone has to a place, the more severe this effect might be. So indigenous populations who traditionally have an intimate connection to the natural world and a heightened sense of place. And then also scientists who study disappearing ecosystems are examples of populations that are at higher risk. But this could really affect anyone with a nature connection, and likely a lot of folks listening today. Finally, the media. So for people who are plugged into it, bad news about climate change is so prevalent that it can be considered part of our environment, acting as an environmental stressor in the sense that it creates a hum of stress in our everyday environment. This is easy to understand because the same thing is happening right now with coronavirus and the anti-racist uprisings. All of those news stories are possibly very emotional for people and even traumatic. So there's a vast spectrum of psychological stressors tied to climate concerns, and people can show up in one or more of these places. I've also included some common physical effects of these mental states, like disrupted sleep, appetite, and digestion caused by persistently elevated levels of the stress hormone cortisol. So that's sort of the background research. We're getting to how the UVM population is affected in that study. I want to just say real quick that it's unsurprisingly my own personal experience that led me into this inquiry. I've absolutely struggled with my own mental health in the face of climate change. And when I was an environmental studies student at the University of Vermont 8 years ago, I felt really confused and deflated when the urgency and gravity of things I learned about in my classes didn't match up with the actions and attitudes of the people around me. And in the decade or so since, I've witnessed other people around me, students, faculty, and staff alike, grappling with that issue mostly pretty quietly. So when the opportunity to quantify this issue came up as part of an existing project with our office and my master's work, it seemed really like the right time to ask the question. And that has continued to be affirmed by articles with headlines like these in our student publications. Now let's talk about what is happening on campus. Our office occasionally assesses campus culture related to sustainability for STARS. And this fall, we incorporated questions on climate change beliefs and attitudes through a survey and interviews. This Wordle that you see on the screen is 90 students responding to the question, what do you see as the most pressing problems our world currently faces? And you can see that climate is a main concern. I'm going to focus on the survey responses today and just underline that data with a few interview excerpts. But these interviews were really informative in forming the survey. So I worked with our Office of Institutional Research to ensure we had representative sampling. The only significant mismatch is oversampling of females and grad students. And yes, this is a small sample, but these quantitative results align very well with what we heard in the 100 student interviews that were conducted in preparation for the survey, which I think really strengthens the validity of this data. The survey was modeled after 2 national survey projects, so I will add some data points in about those just to contextualize our findings. All right, so to set the stage, students really understand that climate change is happening and that it is human caused, much more than the average American, which is indicated with the blue dots. Those blue dots are a combination of agree and strongly agree for Americans. However, students, you can see, are already well above that in only their strongly agree responses. But students start to become less certain about major contributors to climate change and are even less sure about the solutions to it. So we have 84% of students who are certain that climate change is happening, but only 18% are certain about how to respond. So I think you can already start seeing a tension. This graph shows just how serious of a threat students see climate change as. They expect at least a little harm to come across the board, and think of the sort of far from home categories like future generations and plants and animals as being more at risk than the closer to home categories like their generation and themselves. I think this illustrates a recognition of relative privilege, as it's true that most groups on the left are expected to experience climate change faster and more severely than groups on the right. Still, the harm that students anticipate in these close to home categories are much higher than what Americans expect for themselves on average in the blue and yellow dots. I think this articulates how real the threat of climate change is to our students. It's not theoretical, it's very baked into their vision of their futures. And that's something that we heard a lot of stories about in our interviews. Given this, it's natural that they would be talking more about climate change than Americans on average, with friends, family, and classmates alike. The blue line indicates the 36% of Americans who say they often or occasionally talk about climate change. And you can see that more than twice that number of UVM students report often or occasionally talking about climate change, even with family, which seems to be the trickiest area. Students are also hearing about it really frequently from UVM sources. The blue line indicates the 35% of Americans who say they hear about climate change at least once a week from any source, whereas 60% of UVM students are hearing about it just from UVM sources, at least weekly. It's clear that this is influenced by classes because employees are not getting the same amount of exposure. And frankly, our office knows that there's very little centralized climate change communication on campus. Okay, so how are students feeling? Almost everyone is interested, and some of the most commonly held feelings are negative. On average, people picked 3.6 emotions, and sometimes they were in direct conflict with each other. So, for example, people can be angry, as in blaming others, and guilty, as in blaming self, simultaneously. And people's feelings are clearly complicated. These two interview excerpts illuminate that really well. Um, The most common feeling is worry, and UVM students are more worried than Americans or Vermonters on average. So there is a significant relationship between the increased level of optimism and motivation that students studying sustainability felt. I was encouraged by this because it may mean that these majors have figured out how to teach climate change in a more empowering way. For example, this group was also more familiar with the solutions to climate change than the average student. And you can see in the list of majors on the right, there are some usual suspects like environmental science, ENSC, and environmental studies, ENVS. But the undergraduate and graduate business degrees are also included here because their programs meet the program level sustainability gen ed requirement, and we consider them sustainability programs when our office measures stars, so we included them here as well. And I think that's just interesting to note because that might not be what people are thinking of when they look at that. So all of these feelings seem to be manifesting most often in a broad sense of uncertainty and a dampened outlook, with 90% of students experiencing this at some point, most citing occasionally. Over 2/3 of students have at some point felt their mental health and ability to succeed in school was affected, but the level of frequency is much lower for these acute effects. And the effects don't differ significantly for most demographics. I chose to use the affecting success question because that's something our president really has listed as a priority for the university, student success. And then mental health was just a good bucket term, but definitely I recognize that it can risk pathologizing a very rational response to the climate crisis, and not all strong emotional reactions are necessarily mental health concerns. So one place that there is a significant difference with students studying sustainability, again, that same group of majors, although they were feeling more motivated and optimistic than the average student, significantly more of them are often experiencing mental health effects. And these arrows indicate how far up the often section would move for these students. This is just a filled in version of the same graph. So you can see on this slide that 75% or more of these students say that their mental health and ability to succeed at school has at some point been affected. Females are the other group that have been significantly more affected. It's unclear whether this is climate specific because UVM and national data show that females experience and or report more mental health issues overall. But one idea is that family planning decisions could play a part in this difference. Women did bring up questions about that or concerns about that in interviews more often than men, but men did also mention this. And then in national studies, people of color, especially Indigenous people, are identified as a group that is more vulnerable to the psychological effects of climate change. And I don't doubt that that is true at UVM as well, but we are a very white campus, and my sample was likely just too small and too white to show any significance. Although this was anecdotally affirmed by one Indigenous identified stakeholder that I interviewed, who essentially said lovingly, "Welcome to the party," to really underline that her people have been dealing with this pain and trauma for generations. Lastly, I included a comparison slide for employees here. So this is another reason that I'm confident in the survey results, even though it is a small sample. There was a 41% response rate from employees, and the 325 responses clearly show that this is not just a student issue. There's no significant difference between students and employees' experience of mental health and their impact on ability to succeed. So In fact, there's very few major differences between the student and employee data across the board. The information they were hearing from UVM sources about climate change was one of the most significant differences. So I find that our campus culture prioritizes student concerns first. So I'm starting here with the student data, but there's a lot more to dig into on the employee side as well. And a good question around how might employees be expected to support students in this work when they themselves are struggling with the same concerns. So to recap the student situation in a few sentences, UVM students are very well aware of the climate crisis and the threats that it poses to themselves and others. They're interested in the issue and they talk and hear about it frequently. With this heightened sense of awareness comes a variety of emotional responses, and the most commonly held feelings are negative. Most students experience a general sense of uncertainty, and many say that it has affected their mental health or ability to succeed in school. These acute effects are most significant for females and students who are studying sustainability. So addressing the climate crisis, as you all know, requires a massive response at every level, and yet these mental states are not conducive to action. If the people who best understand the problem and are being trained to address it are also becoming paralyzed by it, I feel like we're really in trouble. And psychologist Renee Lertzman explains this very clearly in her recent TED Talk, saying that collective emotional processing might be the missing ingredient in climate action. So there are things that work to combat these negative feelings and their manifestations. I wouldn't call them solutions, more of strategies. They include skills and practices and actions that we want our students to be doing regardless of the climate crisis, because they contribute to being a good citizen and a happy, healthy human. Some action-oriented things might also reduce a person's carbon footprint, but because concern about this issue is very rational and no one person can fix this global problem, these actions can't be offered as a solution to climate change. Instead, these are ways to move from dissonance towards resonance and help manage the emotional responses that people have as they come to terms with and adjust to the inevitable reality of a climate change future. There are some small pockets of campus using these strategies. Some faculty are getting together to think about how to teach climate change in a more responsible way by acknowledging what Sarah Jaquette Ray of Humboldt University calls the hidden emotional curriculum, and by introducing affect and contemplative practices into their classrooms. The program that I run, EcoReps, took on this theme for a quarter of the year, and that included creating a video called Climate Feels that interviews UVMers on their emotional responses to climate change. We showed it on the last night of our 5-part climate film and conversation series, where we watched climate films and talked about our emotional responses to the material. This all happened remotely during the beginning of the COVID shutdown in the spring. We also, through that exercise, just had a lot of great conversations internally with our team about how climate showed up in our emotional lives. And it was really a great experience, sort of just bringing us closer together as a team. Students are writing about this in student publications on campus, and 2 environmental studies students are dedicating their undergrad theses to this topic. There is also now a new 6-week short course available for students on mindfulness and climate change, run by a professor in our environmental school. And that's sort of a hybrid being created by faculty and offered to students. However, the staff area is really the big gap that I see. So there's not a lot going on in this realm. And I worked on the staff side in sort of the Division of Student Affairs side of campus for 4.5 years before moving to the more facilities side of the Office of Sustainability. And I really understand the role of that student affairs staff group in the lives of our students. So whether that's through campus-wide programming, on, you know, concerts or wellness or whatever that might be, to a one-on-one career center appointment. Staff in this area are absolutely shaping the student experience every day. It's in fact their entire job, what their role is all about. And they also want students to be healthy, engaged, and successful. And they actually already work to foster many of the skills that I shared about that are most effective in addressing climate distress, like personal resilience, for example. And I think that they are just a really important key to the puzzle that hasn't been fully addressed yet. And I feel uniquely situated to focus on that gap. So that was one outcome of the research, is the need to focus specifically there. So I met with various stakeholder groups over the spring and summer to get their input on these results and understand what they thought should be done on campus as a response. So in doing that, I put together a one-pager highlighting some of the key findings of the research in addition to the primary stakeholder ideas. And I'll just run through a couple of winning ideas right now. So with the staff group, a main idea was to add group counseling about climate change into the existing group counseling framework. And the final suggestion here is actually something that we're moving forward with this fall, offering a professional development and training session for staff specifically on this topic. The winning idea out of the faculty realm was to train TAs of sustainability classes on this topic and how to handle it in practice. So noticing that those students are in the high risk group, and then they're also teaching other high risk students. And so how might we best prepare them for embarking on that? Finally, the students, I didn't get to share with nearly as many students as I hoped because of COVID and going remote for the spring semester. So the main idea really is to continue sharing this information broadly to reduce the stigma and inform social norms about really the prevalence of this concern across campus, and hopefully partner with the student government to do that work. Finally, overall, the next step is to form a working group in order to implement these ideas, address the employee data, which I mentioned is a whole data set that hasn't been explored as deeply, and then conduct follow-up research after various changes are made to see if there is any improvement in the reported mental health effects. So I recognize that that is a lot of information, and it's heavy and not always easy to take in. So I want to just invite everyone to close your eyes and take a deep breath. And maybe write down 3 feelings that are present for you in this moment. Not what you're thinking about or notes that you want to take to your campus, but really how you're feeling in this moment. And this is just a practice of the best practices that we know. Some of the ways to address climate anxiety is to really tune in to those feelings, be present and understand and acknowledge that pain before moving forward. So I really appreciate you tuning into this presentation, and I am sorry we can't be doing it in person, so I really welcome any follow-up questions, ideas that you have. I'd love to hear from folks who are doing anything similar on their campuses, and just connect with anyone interested in this work. So thank you again, and don't hesitate to reach out.